Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining me for the 13th episode in the Conversations with Alan series. I'm Alan Locher. There is a quote in the Talmud, whoever saves a life saves the world. This quote hits home for me personally, as my life story is one that could have turned out quite differently if not for some very brave men and women who risked their lives and the lives of their families to save my mother and my father during World War II. I created this series to have open and honest discussions about the rise of hate and the rise of anti Semitism, with high hopes that it leads to conversations that make us all think about our own place in history and what we can do to change our country's course to stop hate in all its forms. Tonight, Limor Vink, who works as the regional coordinator of the Anti-Defamation League's New York, New Jersey office, is here to share her story about her remarkable grandparents. One, a Holocaust survivor, and the other, a righteous Gentile who helped save the lives of the Lowenstein family in the Netherlands during World War II, very similarly to my story. Two very different stories in her family, but each very powerful in their own right. Limor and I have this unique connection to the Netherlands and to World War II. After finishing her graduate studies in psychology, Limor decided to become involved in an organization that would fulfill her aspirations to help others and become part of an organization that educates about the Holocaust to young children and teens and fight hate in all its forms. The story of her grandparents, the survivors, and those who rescued them is following her with each step of her path. Being a part of both ends, knowing the consequences of what it means for one to be prosecuted from one end and what the other can do for those who are being harassed, is the actual embodiment of the two narratives in her identity that she has tried to navigate over the years. I am really excited she's here to share her story with all of you. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Locher Room, Limor Vink. Hey, Limor.
Hi, Alan.
Did I get that right?
It was perfect. It was more than perfect. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for being here and your willingness to share your story. It really, I really believe conversations can change the world. If people are willing to listen to you, to my story, to others, it's the way we all learn, and hopefully change can come about from those conversations.
Absolutely. I agree with you. And it happens to be that I'm the vehicle for these voices from the past, right? For my family. And I'm happy to be here and share their stories.
I love how you just said that, the vehicle. I've said it before in this series. I really didn't fully understand what my parents had been through while they were alive. I mean, I started to later in life while my mom was still alive, and my dad, he died in 1999. But it is true. I have definitely become their vehicle because they are no longer here to share their story.
Exactly. I agree
Yeah.
with you.
Well, you were fascinated as a child with history. Where did the fascination stem from?
That's a great question. I think, well, I can take it both to two way. I think one is absolutely related. It is the intellectual curiosity with past events. I think it's definitely something I inherited from my father. I think he went more to the business side, but he told me that retrospectively he wished to study history in school and also going on to the academic route and perhaps a PhD in history. He was fascinated with the Second World War, actually, generally, and specifically with the Holocaust. So he knows so much about the subject, so much. Even though he didn't receive a formal education about it, he was self-taught and he read a lot. So I think that that is something that I definitely have, have something from him. But there was also, I think, a curiosity to understand my roots a little bit better. And I think was stemming from, I think, as a confused child that hears multiple languages at her grandparents' house. And obviously, my mother is Israeli and my father is originally from Holland. Um, Being born to interfaith couple, um, being born in Holland and then moving to Israel, understanding that my grandparents were originally from Poland. I mean, there were so many identities.
Mm.
And I think being born to a mixed cultural family, I just had the urge to try to understand. I'm trying to intellectualize it a little bit too much,
How it all came together.
how it came together,
Yeah.
and how 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 come I'm here now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think I had that urge to ask questions, and it was encouraged by my family members. I think that a lot of times, third gens of Holocaust survivors, they weren't sure what was really happening um, um, to their family members, or maybe even their parents, right? Second generation Holocaust survivors, they didn't speak about it because it wasn't, I mean, the history was just, it was silenced for many reasons in our
And that
household.
I actually want to
Yes.
narrow in on that point because it's interesting because you really had a fascination with history whereas I didn't. I think history was something I really did not like, and I wonder if it was because it was sort of silenced as a young child in my home. Now I have this fascination to learn more and pay attention so much more. But back when I was really young, I history was not something I really enjoyed, and I wonder if it had to do with, you know, just what was happening around me in the home about their particular history.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting point. I never thought about it that way. And it wasn't as well. Did you know about the stories, or it wasn't talked about?
I knew that they were Holocaust survivors. It really, for me, I think I really started to want to learn more after Schindler's List and
Mm.
after my sister and I convinced my parents to do the video for the Shoah Foundation. You
Mm.
know, so, sitting there while those videos were being recorded for the Holocaust Museum, I really heard the stories, in full and sort of in the painful details of what they were willing to share, things I didn't remember, and sort of when tears would flow. But it's interesting, you know, you had that thirst for it, and at that time I did not at all.
It's interesting, Alan, and it reminds me what my mother actually told me. And both of her parents were survivors, and even though the stories were talked about freely
From
and
Poland,
from Poland.
yeah, Holocaust survivors from Poland.
Correct, from Poland. She told me, I mean, when I really started to dive into the stories from both sides, she did tell me, it's easy, it's so much easier for you. I think it was too much to bear for her to hear, and really to go back and try to understand what her parents went through. And she said that generational gap, um, maybe it played a part as well, because I don't know what it means to grow up with a parent who was a survivor.
Right, right.
So
Well, and your mother did, and the story, your grandfather's story of survival against those odds. Can you talk about, you know, his family?
yes, absolutely. It's obviously it's his life story. I will try to be succinct. There's
Yeah.
so many details, but
Well, I think sort of what's important, because of the impact was what happened to his family.
right, right. And I think also his journey afterwards, what happened to them, and the choice he made with the encouragement of his mother to run away, and all the feelings that were associated with that, complicated feelings, right? Because he survived and they didn't. But this was at the prosecution of his village, of the Jewish people in his village, was quite at the beginning of the war. So he was born and raised in a small town called Brzezany. Now it's actually in the territories of Ukraine, but it was in eastern Poland back in the day. And so in 1939, with the Nazis, in September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, the Russians invaded the other half of Poland. So that was the eastern territory. And so his village was occupied by the Russians until 1941. And the conditions under the Russians, obviously it's war conditions, they weren't favorable, but they weren't prosecuted. And so in 1941, when the Nazis invaded the entire country of Poland, then the nightmare began. His home was invaded just one evening by the stormtroopers. They were, I believe it was a holiday. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest holiday, according to the Jewish tradition. They were sitting having dinner, the Jewish dinner, the holiday dinner before the fasting, and the stormtroopers bursted in, and they started to confiscate and steal their belongings, also very valuable belongings like gold menorahs and gold, everything that you might think as valuable. And my great grandfather Nachman, he rebelled against them, and they shot him right there and then, and they left. And then I believe in the summer, so this was around September, October, I think. And then in the summer, in another holiday, Shavuot, May or June, they stormed again, and this time they didn't resist. It is actually an important detail. He had one sister who was older than him. She was, I believe, 20, 21. He was 17 when this was happening. And then he had a young sister named Basha. She was 7. And so they took his oldest sister to a labor camp, and they never saw her again. We believe she was probably perished in one of the concentration camps nearby, probably Belzec, but I don't know. I actually searched in Yad Vashem records to try and find out about her whereabouts were, what was happening then, and nothing came through.
It's very, very similar to my father's older sister. We don't
she
really
was
know.
taken away, and then,
well, she resisted going with his parents and him when they left, and they don't know what happened to her. She resisted.
Did you try?
I know that they have. I haven't personally, but I know that they did, and I don't think they know much, because they couldn't, I mean, my father's side was he and his brother were separated from his parents for a while, but thankfully reunited, but they never found her again.
It was another member, right? And it was, again, the second trauma of the whole family, right? The father was murdered, and now the sister was gone, and there were the 3 of them left. And back then, it was before the time, I believe it was 1941. So the main method of murder was mass executions. And so they were taken away to the nearby forest, and his mother understood right away what was going on. And she told them, I believe, while they were digging the graves, you have to go, you have to leave, you have to run right now. And he said, no, I'm not leaving you. I'm not leaving both of you. And she said, just go. You save yourself. I can't, I'm too old. She was, by the way, she was 45. But I think there was just, she didn't have enough energy it was too much for her, and she urged him to run. And so they were guarded with numerous soldiers with German shepherds. That, by the way, when we were little, my sister and I, my grandfather was really, really scared of dogs, and he specifically pointed to German shepherds in the street and he said, "You see that dog? It's an evil dog." He was traumatized
Wow.
by these dogs, so he ran away. He ran away from the squad. Um, he ran away to the nearby forest. Obviously, immediately, numerous soldiers were after him with the dogs, and apparently, he was fast enough to find a hiding place.
A-
Um,
And he survived.
he survived. But by the way, afterwards, he joined a Jewish fighting brigade. It's also called the Partisans. So he got the weapons. They got it from the underground, I think, from the Polish underground or from nearby neighbors, and they fought back.
Wow. It's crazy. When did you start asking questions about, both sides of your family?
I think I'm trying to think if there was, well, with my father there was a pivotal moment. There were a few pivotal moments, and that was a process. But with my mother's side of the family, it was more accessible, right? Obviously, we lived close by. Um, Physically, we were near my grandparents. My mother kept telling us the stories. My grandfather, by the way, my sister reminded me of that. He told us about his story from the very beginning, and he modified it in a way, I don't know how, but that can be somewhat digestible to young children. I don't think it can, but he told us, for example, he didn't dive into the very grim details, but he said, and then I ran into the forest, and there was these pack of wolves and lions that helped me, and they were taking care of me. So he added these, he embellished the story in a
Yeah,
way,
he
yeah,
embellished it.
exactly, in a way that we would
Wow.
find it fascinating. And I remember looking at him thinking, he's my hero. It sounded like a real life hero, right? He survived
Yeah.
against all odds. Um,
Well, it definitely was against all odds. The fact that you and I are sitting here having this conversation is against all odds.
Absolutely.
You,
Absolutely.
you know, without his mother telling him to run, you know,
He didn't want to leave. I think, by the way, most of his life, he suffered from nightmares.
mm,
And my mother actually also, well, she told me that the guilt, the feelings of survivor's guilt, right? It was very much pronounced in his day-to-day life. He felt guilty until the last day. He felt guilty that in his eyes, he abandoned them,
wow.
right? Um,
Oh, I'm sure there are so many Jewish people who survived who have that same guilt.
right.
It it would be hard not to, I think. I do. Unlike your mother, your father was not Jewish, and he grew up in a highly Protestant family. Talk about what you know about his side of the family.
His like I said, unlike my family in Israel, which physically was accessible, all the information, right? Both of my grandparents were talking about their family's history. Mentally, also, they shared. It wasn't, of course, it was hard for them. I cannot assume. Of course, it entailed some sort of emotional capacity to sit down and share with everyone their stories one time after the other, because it was really a lot of times. But on the other hand, with my father, he physically, we didn't live close to my grandmother. She was living in Holland. We lived in Israel. We came to visit her only once a year, and then also for a very short period of time. And my grandfather passed away in 1976, so my father was 24. So I didn't know my grandfather, and he
Wait, your grandfather in Holland passed away in
yes,
1976?
Yes.
My grandmother, my mother's mother, passed away in 1976
In Holland?
in
Or
Holland. Yeah,
wow.
I was 10 years old. That's how I know.
Mm.
My mother went home, after her mom passed.
And did
Crazy,
you
crazy
get
coincidences.
yes. So where was this in Holland?
In Amsterdam. My grandmother lived in
In
Amsterdam.
Amsterdam.
Yeah. Both of my parents were born in Amsterdam.
And did you have a close relationship with her? Do you remember?
No,
Right.
I, I think I only might have met her once when I was 4. We had gone over there. Um, my sister probably had been around her a little more because my sister was 5 years older than me, but
Mm.
I did not know her, sadly.
I think that the physical proximity really does it plays a part here, right? Because we didn't have FaceTime back then. I mean, I grew up in the 90s, so I mean, I didn't get the chance to see my grandmother, and I didn't hear much about my grandfather. It was, yeah.
And, and so interesting too, because my parents left Holland and came to this country, so they really were leaving that part of their world behind them. My dad's parents moved here first. My dad moved, and I'm sure they probably moved here, you know, for a better life, to not forget, but
Right.
to to heal after losing their daughter and their sister, but by the time I was born, um, there weren't a lot of uh, people around, I think, me talking about it on a regular basis.
I think that's crucial. I think that's
Hmm.
crucial. And then um I don't know what your experience was like with your parents, but my father, who was an only child, he told me that
My
his
mother was an
parents,
only child
oh,
too,
so there you go. I
and,
didn't
and
have,
Dutch, right? Your father and my mother, both only childs. Wow.
so no, I didn't have uncles or aunts to bypass my father, who said, no, there's nothing, there's not much to tell there because I don't know anything. They never told me anything. So basically he was my only source. And my grandmother, by the way, Limor Vink, she passed away when I was 10. So I was very young. I didn't have, basically I had no relatives to ask questions about. And her sisters, my grandmother's sisters, and my great grandfather, which we will be talking about, Jan Willem, they immigrated to Canada. So my grandmother and grandfather were the only ones who stayed in Holland after the war. So I didn't have any outlets, anyone to ask questions about.
Well, at the age of 17, you visited the camps in, where was that again? In Treblinka, right?
In Poland. So we actually, it was a long trip. It was a 10-day trip, if I'm not mistaken, and it was all across Poland. All
Wow.
across Poland. I actually remember. I remember the bus rides because they were so long. They were so long. We were driving for hours. So it was across Poland, from Warsaw to Auschwitz to Treblinka to Balzec. Yes.
I can't imagine seeing that at 17.
There's a lot of preparation beforehand, but even so, you have the educational staff that is there to support you. But even so, I agree with you. There isn't much. There's a limit in terms of how much you can be actually prepared, mentally prepared. I think that at the beginning of the trip, by the way, we were starting around Warsaw. We were observing the ghetto and another very critical um, um, points in the war, well, in terms of the Jewish community. And I do remember being a bit detached. It was hard for me to tune in with my emotions because, especially in Warsaw, you see this hustling, bustling city. Everything looks super modern. So you look at the site and you're being told that this is where Jews were transferred from one point to another. Here was the ghetto, and you see the borders, but you see a coffee shop or you see a clothing store, and it's so hard. It's not tangible at all. And
Mm.
I did feel there was some point I thought that there was something wrong with me, because obviously I had a lot of friends and even teachers who were crying, and they were in tune with their emotions. And it took me towards the end of the trip, then everything, I let everything loose.
Mm.
By the way,
Well,
because yes,
the tour guide, what he showed you about the village in Treblinka, do you remember?
yes, I was well, Treblinka also, it was a challenge for me to be there. Then I started to become very emotional. Also because I know for a fact that a lot of the extended family members from both sides, from my grandmother and grandfather, were perished there. And I felt this weird energy in that space. I really did. And it's weird because you don't have the boots, not the boots, the actually campsite. Everything was destroyed after the war by the Germans, or before the war ended, to remove any evidence. But it's encircled with this forest, and energetically it's this very bizarre space to be. And you hear about the numbers, and you can't really wrap your mind around this. It was a very emotional experience for me. And then I remember seeing there was a village nearby, also near Auschwitz, by the way. There are people residing really close. Also during the war in the 1940s, there were villagers right next to the camp.
Living right there, watching what was happening at the camps.
Right. Or turning the shoulder, right?
Right.
Not even observing it.
Turning a blind eye to what was happening in the camp.
Exactly. Turning a blind eye. And to be honest, it was shocking. And I think that was perhaps the starting point of me. Something was bothering me, because I knew that there was this other side that wasn't Jewish. They were residing in Holland. By the way, they were farmers, such as my grandfather's family. They were also farmers. Everything was taken away from them. And then I was thinking about my father's family. And so I of course I didn't
Right.
want to jump
The,
into conclusions.
right. But the non-Jewish side of your family, you became curious what what they were doing at this point of the war.
It was really important for me to know. I didn't, like I said, I didn't jump into rash conclusions,
Mm-hmm.
but like I said, I did read a lot about during that dark period, and I learned that 75%, if not more, I think between 75% to 80% of the Dutch Jewish population were perished. So I believe it's one of the highest. I think it's the highest percentage of Jewish population that was murdered in Western Europe, at least. I believe that's the highest
Wow.
percentage. So, and again, perhaps I'm wrong. I'm not an expert, but I was not naive, and I was thinking to myself, there were a lot of Dutch collaborators with the Nazi Party that was also going on. So I didn't think that I didn't know I didn't know what to think, but
And I
it
find
was
that
triggering.
fascinating. Yes, I find that fascinating because I can't imagine having, these both sides of your family, and 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 when it starts to dawn in your head and you start thinking like, what were they doing? I believe there was a news story that you saw on an Israeli television station that prompted you to start asking questions. What was the news story?
Yes, that's also, I think that's the most pivotal point of me really. After that, I was going to my father and said, we have to find out. We have to find out. So I saw this news article about a young adult. I believe he was in his early 20s. Like he was, I think, probably my age as well. And he spoke about his family's history. So his father was a second generation Holocaust survivor. And he knew that his mother was from Germany. She was Gentile from Germany. And he wanted to know more. He wanted to know about that side. It was silenced. He didn't know much. And his mother, after many years of deliberations of back and forth, no, there's nothing you should, I mean, there's nothing to tell. He was insisting. And she told him that his grandfather was a Nazi officer. And he spoke, I mean, it was a very interesting story because he said that he didn't know how to really integrate, right, both histories within himself. It was a challenge, and it really made an impact. It really made an impact.
Is that when you started to ask your dad for some information?
Yes, I definitely wanted to know more. I definitely wanted more. And all of a sudden, when I started to really annoy him, I received bits of information, and that was helpful. All of a sudden, oh, I remember when I was little, right? When I was a young boy, I believe I was 8 or 9 years old. There was this family who happened to be Jewish who came to our house, and they had a young boy. He was also an only child, so they connected on that level. And he was older than me. He was about 14. And he remembered that encounter specifically because they were a Jewish family from Amsterdam, and they were very emotional, both families. And at the end, the Jewish family from Amsterdam, who were Dutch, also Dutch, they gave them a present. They gave them a clock, and then they waved goodbye and left. And he was playing with this young Jewish boy, but he didn't really realize, he wasn't sure who they were. He never saw them again. It was the first and last time that he saw this family, and they gave him a clock. I mean, they gave his parents a clock. So obviously there was some meaningful connection there, meaningful relationship. But it was definitely definitely odd.
It's crazy that encounter and that gift struck such a chord in your dad for him to remember it.
Right. And I think mostly it was because well, they were living in Zwolle. It's mostly Protestant Christian community. There weren't a lot of there weren't a lot of Jews living nearby. And so for a family to travel from Amsterdam to that village, it was pretty far. I don't know how many miles it is from Amsterdam, but it's quite a ride. And to come this far, I mean, what's the backstory there?
Hmm.
There's more there than we think. And probably he thought so too, but he didn't. I don't know. I think also the culture in the house was don't ask, don't tell. And later on, I think I do understand the logic of my grandmother. I mean, there was the psychology about not telling, about not mentioning the story was obviously perhaps because they knew that in the war that there were consequences, right? If you talk too much, there were some consequences. So
Some major consequences.
major consequences, yeah. So I
Yeah,
definitely think that was one of the reasons why she didn't mention anything to my father.
interesting. And how did you start? Once he told you that part of the story, what did you do to get more details? How did you start putting the pieces together?
I I immediately thought that it was probably some pre-war relationship, right? This was early 60s, so probably there has to be something related to the war. Otherwise, why would they connect? I mean, in what networks and in what capacity? It was too strange. And so I started to ask him, well, do you remember the last name? No, he didn't remember anything. He didn't remember the last name, not a single name. A few months, and then it was taking me a while, right? I was kind of preoccupied with that, and then I was studying, and I returned back, and I was asking more questions about I asked my father more questions, and then returned to my regular routine. I mean, it took me a while, and it took my father also a while to remember things. And so I think uh, maybe a year later, I asked him again, what about that family? And he remembered the last name, which was Lowenstein. He said, oh, I know. And he really did not remember the name. He didn't remember the name. He thought it was something else. And then it struck him. Okay, it's Lowenstein. Their name was Lowenstein. Well, I think they moved to Jerusalem. I think they immigrated to Israel. And I said, so they probably live here. Well, I was living back home in Israel at the time, and I said, well, maybe we can find them. Maybe we can go to the bottom of this and really just find out what was the relationship, what happened there. And again, a couple of months probably passed by, and we also had a first name and a last name, which was James Lowenstein. And my father assumed that that was the son, that was the little boy he played with back then in the 1960s in his home, in his
It
parents'
is
home.
it's amazing sometimes, you say on one day I can't remember, and then all of a sudden it just pops in to all of us. Your dad, all of us, we all have those instances where you can't remember something and then it just comes back to you, right?
Yes,
You
yes,
know, it,
absolutely. Absolutely. I think, yes, I don't know how come yes, I'm actually curious to ask my dad about that moment. How come you remembered one day? Maybe I nagged him enough for him to, I don't know,
yeah.
to investigate and try to reflect more.
Yeah, you probably jogged his memory, and it's not something he probably thought about on a daily basis. And then by just bringing that up and reliving it, maybe, you hear the name in the back of your head or something. Yeah, I find that fascinating because, when you first started asking, you had neither a first or a last name.
No, nothing, nothing. Just a location. Perhaps he did remember that they immigrated to Israel, perhaps to Jerusalem. He did remember the city, Jerusalem. But I think also on some level, my dad maybe needed a push from the outside, and I was the push. He needed. I didn't have sentiments to the story as well, and I think maybe on some level I think my grandmother was very stubborn and she didn't share any details. And so perhaps my father embraced that as well. Maybe we'll just let the past be the past, right?
Well, and
But
it's, for your grandmother, that time of taking another family in or helping anybody was the most dangerous thing you could do for your own family.
right,
So
right.
it's really understandable. I have this conversation all the time today with my sister who's married and has two children. The family that saved my mother's and my mother and my grandmother risked 11 lives to take in my mother and grandmother. My sister always turns to me. I have no idea what I would do. And I think
Mm,
that's for most of us until we're put in that position. And we all hope we would do the same thing as your grandmother and the families who helped my family would do.
right, right. It is absolutely a mechanism of fear there. Obviously.
100%.
Um,
You have to understand it. You can't judge somebody on that fear. So you had his first and last name, you had the city. What did you start to do?
I think we didn't start to investigate right away. Again, I know it may sound strange, but it was this touch and go every single time. It's as if my father and I needed the courage together to kind of to build up and try to dive into the story. It wasn't, and then immediately we started to research frantically. No, it wasn't like that. But I think that every a few months I was urging, I mean, something was triggering within me and it bothered me. And I told them, okay, did you find them? Did you find them? I did. I think that at some point I told them, well, Google his first name and last name and see what comes up. So it took us a while. It did take us a while, but I was on it. I was on it. And one day, this is actually my father's initiative alone. I didn't ask him if he can contact the family, if he found anything. On Yom HaShoah, which is the Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel, officially, it's around April and May. I believe it was in 2014. No, I'm sorry, 2013. In Yom HaShoah 2013, he took the initiative. He Googled James Lowenstein in Jerusalem. The address he saw on Google added up, and it looked like the right individual, and there was a cell phone number there. So he called on the evening of Yom HaShoah, and this is I didn't know about this. And he called the number, and a woman's voice was on the other side of the phone, and she said, "Who am I speaking with?" And he said, "This is Anthony Vink. I'm looking for James Lowenstein." And then the phone was dropped, and he didn't hear anything. And he thought, oh, this is odd. And then there was some scrambling noise immediately, and the woman on the other side said, "I cannot believe it. I cannot believe it. I cannot believe it." I think she spoke Hebrew. And she said, "My husband has been looking for you and your family for years." And on this meaningful day, right? I still get chills when
Yeah.
after hearing that. I'm telling this story, but this is my father's experience. And when he told me that, I was shocked. I said, "You found them and he was looking for you?" I cannot believe it. And immediately, it's funny. James Lowenstein's wife, she was, I think she was grocery shopping, and she was in the middle of this commotion. She said, I need to run back to my house. I need to tell my husband." She was very, very excited and happy, obviously, and there were a lot of emotions going on. And immediately they got connected, James and my father. And this happened very quickly. We arranged a meeting at our house. And they had so many questions, obviously. How come you're in Israel?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you live only 50 miles or 40 miles away from me? That's crazy.
Wow.
So
And James told your dad about how his mother and grandfather hid James's, right? They hid James's parents in the attic for 8 months.
yes. This was 1943. I believe so apparently when the story was unfolding, we realized that
And in this attic,
yes,
right?
correct. So this is actually the two windows in the bottom. This is the dairy shop, and then the little window on top, that's the attic where the Lowensteins were hidden. And so as you can see, my great grandfather Jan Willem and my grandmother, they were operating this dairy shop full time, right? The individuals coming in and out. It's super dangerous, obviously, and the Lowensteins needed to be almost silent for the entire hours of operations. And not only that, because the neighbors in the adjacent building were members of the Dutch Nazi Party. So I think that most of the day they were supposed to be, no movement whatsoever.
And this was in Zwolle?
Yes, no, I'm sorry. This is in Driebergen. So it's a small town near Utrecht.
Oh,
Zwolle, my
okay. Yeah.
grandmother, when she was married with my grandfather, my father was born and raised in Zwolle.
It's crazy again, the similarities to my mother, because James's family was hidden in 1943, which is around the same time my mother was hidden on the farm that she was at, because she was there from 43 until the end of the war.
And I think, Alan, I think that we calculated the distance on Google Maps between Driebergen and the village where your mother was hidden. It was
I think you did it. It's yeah, because my mother was hidden in Bunschoten, and I don't think that's very far from Utrecht. So yeah, crazy. It's
I
similarities, but it makes
right.
sense because of how many people were in hiding and how many Jews ended up dead in Holland. But it's crazy. What happened when James and his wife came to meet your parents?
It was this beautiful gathering. It was amazing. His family, his daughters came along as well. Um, it was just time flew by, really. It was like you can imagine it to be. It was very, very emotional. Um, they couldn't believe it that we grew up Jewish and Israel. I mean, that's strange. That is strange. That my father married an Israeli Jewish woman. Um, yes, it
And
was
ended up living so close by.
so close by without knowing. He actually, by the way, James traveled to Holland numerous times to look for my grandmother and great grandfather because his parents were not alive during the time of the conversation with my father. They passed away, but he heard details and he had the names, but he couldn't find them. And so he was traveling to Holland. It was really, really important for him to to just acknowledge them and also get to know them and hear about their side of the story. And unfortunately, I wish we knew more. I wish we had more details, but I'm grateful for what we do have.
Correct. And if anybody is watching today and you have grandparents and parents, whatever your history, ask questions, write it down. Do not wait until it is too late, or they're too old, or they're gone, because it really is so important to know. I say it. I mean, I like you got to James got to honor your dad's family, correct? Right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and we're so
And,
grateful.
yes. And like I was able to do that, but I luckily, before my mother passed away, had gotten some information that if I did not get, I probably would have never been able to do that. And I just encourage anybody, get the information from your family, you know, while it's easy to get. You were persistent, Limor. If you think about that, if you didn't persist with your father, you you may never James may never have gotten to see your dad again.
I think about I actually my father my and also my father is really grateful for that, and I'm grateful that I pushed. I'm usually not very much an assertive person, but I guess something was bothering me, and I think I like what you said because I think it's so important. My grandmother and I didn't know my great grandfather, but what I understood, they weren't greater than life personas, right? They were common people. The act that they did obviously is greater than life and should be cherished forever. But I no one, I mean everyone, every family has a hidden story. I really do believe in that. So ask, investigate, and
It's
obviously,
important. Know your history.
exactly. Know
Yeah.
your history.
Yep. And so you were able to honor honor the family on October 19th when they were recognized by Yad Vashem as the righteous among the nations. Um, you know, um, at Yad Vashem, they engraved their names on the wall under the Netherlands, and they are presented with a medal with the words I said earlier that are in the Talmud. It is written in Hebrew, but it basically reads, "He who saves a life, save the world," which I find as one of the most powerful statements because it's so, so true.
I truly, it is a very emotional phrase. I love that statement, and I think it's a very important call for all of us to think. You know, sometimes we live our lives and we think, oh, what can I do? I'm only one individual, right? Against these huge forces, everything can happen, and obviously we do have obstacles and challenges that we need to face, but it really does made an impact on how I live my life. I really do believe that I have an impact, and it only takes one individual to change something. It's all that it takes. It really is.
Uh,
And
it is so true. And again, one individual, with my mom, it was a 17-year-old boy who went to his parents to take in my parents, to take in my mother and her grandmother. He asked his parents, one individual who was 17 years old. I don't think I would have known to do that at 17, or been smart enough to suggest something that literally has impacted lives, 76 years later.
I agree. I don't know. The only thing that I can do is really be inspired by these figures of light. They're figures of light in my eyes. And
100%. Lee, who is watching right now, asked, and I don't think so, but I will ask it. James, was he in the attic as well?
oh, that's an important detail actually that I did not mention. So what happened was they were starting to have these they had the neighbors, the suspicious well, they weren't suspicious, but at some point eventually they heard the couple. So Henny and Kurt, James's parents, were just a couple then. They didn't have James yet. And they started to hear these noises, and what happened was is that in the night, I don't know how, but my great grandfather and grandmother contacted the Dutch resistance. Apparently, they had some contacts there. So they were transferred. Henny and Kurt were transferred in the middle of the night to a temporary hiding place, and then to a new hiding place where James eventually, really, before the war ended, he was born there. In the second
Mm.
hiding place, that, by the way, that family was also recognized by James in Yad Vashem.
Oh, wow.
Yes,
Amazing.
yes.
And I wanted to show this as well. Here's everyone at Yad Vashem.
Yes, so you can see my father in the middle and James right next to him. My father is holding the medal and the certificate of honor. And then
Yeah.
from the right side, it's James, his wife, and both of his daughters. And actually, there was one representative from the Dutch embassy who was there.
Amazing.
Yes, and then from the left, it's my sister, me, and my mother.
We did the ceremony in Holland, not at Yad Vashem. We did it at the consulate, I believe, in Den Haag.
Oh, and did you
The
still?
Israelis, the Israeli consulate with, yeah, their whole family was there. Everybody, yeah, it was. I mean, because, like I said, it was. There were 9 children and the parents, and 3 or 4 of the children were still alive when we did the ceremony. So
So how old were they? Did they?
there,
So
yeah.
your mother?
So my mother was from age 3 to 8 during the war. So she was probably 6 to 8 when she was with them, and one of their daughters was her best friend. They were basically the same age,
Mm-hmm.
and that's who. I am very close with her daughters, and they, it's interesting because I forget how they explain it to me, but they didn't really understand what their grandparents had done until they kept hearing my sister and I talk about how grateful we were. And without them doing what they did, we would not be here. Like it really took them to hear it over and over again to fully understand the impact they had on this family across the world in the United States.
Did they know, did the siblings, did they know that your mother was Jewish?
I don't, I would assume some of I don't know what age range the kids were, um, but I assume my mother went to school with them because my mother was of Portuguese descent and did not look Jewish.
Mm.
So she wore the traditional Dutch costume of the village and she went to school with them. Her mother basically lived in not an attic, but a basement thing that was, so small. And she barely ever left that space for the 2 years she was there.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's crazy the similarities. You have a graduate degree in psychology, but decided to become involved with the Anti-Defamation League. What prompted your desire to work for that organization, and what does your work there mean to you?
That's a great question. I think, well, my initial aspiration was to help clinical populations, right? People who were affected by trauma. Um, and I realized, again, it was a couple of years journey, that also that my professional aspiration was also rooted in my grandparents' past, and I understood what it means to be, how family trauma is affecting generations after generations. And so I really wanted to be involved in clinical work. Um, and along with that, obviously the story came about already when I was at school, and I still was extremely passionate about fighting hate and fighting anti-Semitism. And in 2017, I believe it was, yes, Charlottesville was a pivotal moment for me. Yes, the rally in Charlottesville. I saw the images. By the way, I was in Israel. It was during a family visit, and I watched it along with my
Wow.
father with the torches and what they chanted, and I was in complete shock. I think that if my grandparents were alive, thank God they
You,
weren't alive to see it, right, in real
you,
life.
you, you're making me cry because that really, I didn't have this platform then, but it is the same thing for me. It was the impetus because my parents were deceased when that happened, and I could not imagine sitting like you were sitting with your dad, sitting with my mother and father. I just could not. 70 something years later, I just don't know what that response. My mother, I think she would have gone under a bed and never come out. I just, it really, it's a frightening thought. And
It,
yeah, right. I'm right there
yes,
with
no,
you because
I, it was a shock. It rocked my world. And by the way, this was only 2 years after I immigrated to the States. Um, it was extremely worrisome. And I think that back then already it's starting to brewing within me that, okay, I cannot stand still. I cannot stand still. I want to be involved in something that really is fighting this. Um, Extremism, hate, and anti-Semitism, racism, everything related to that. And in a way, I think that the transition, also COVID kind of urged me to pursue my passion. Um, and I realized that I cannot stand still, and I want to be involved in an organization that is doing exactly that. And even if it's in a supportive role, right? I know that I'm supporting my colleagues out there and doing the job,
doing, yes,
right? And I'm
doing great work,
Exactly.
doing work
Exactly.
that needs to be done. But I didn't remember that, and we must have spoken about that when we first spoke, because it was Charlottesville for me, and the thought of that is such a frightening thing for me to think of what that would have, it would have shook my mom for my dad was a little quieter in his demeanor, but
Hmm.
my mom, again, only child. She was really young during that time, and I can't imagine. I think of what you and I are saying right now about what it meant to us watching that, and we don't have that firsthand experience.
Exactly. So the impact, I mean, it's probably greater than the
Yeah,
words can describe. Um,
exactly. Uh,
Absolutely.
uh, Before I let you go, we've talked a lot about what do you hope people who might watch this tonight take away from your story?
It's a big question. I think well, I think I might repeat the message I mentioned before. I think that oftentimes we we think that we do not have the capacity to help one another, and it's only me against the world, and there are too many forces. I mean, just don't be a cynic. Don't be a cynic. You really can. You do have the influence to impact someone's life to for the better, and I truly believe in that. I do. I really do believe in that. Obviously, this is an extreme example of civil courage, right? The story of my ancestors, but it's in the little things in life. It really is in the day-to-day life of the act of service that we can do for one another, even a stranger, your friend, or your family member, or whatever. It's in the little things. It doesn't have to be this bombastic act of altruism. It's just maybe being kind is enough.
Hold the door open, say hello, smile.
Right,
You
right.
know, Smiling can really change somebody's, really saying hello, opening the door, saying thank you. Little things, but they do make a difference in people's lives.
Absolutely. I can really say that getting to know the story, it really changed the perspective, my life perspective, and the way I'm navigating life. And again, it's in the small details. It's like I said, it doesn't have to be this grandiose moments. It really is in the little details.
Well, it really is so important that we speak up, we share our story, because first of all, it reminds people of what happened, that it happened to someone they know, and for those people who try to deny, we're living proof that it happened. We're living proof that thanks to good people, there was a happy ending for us, not necessarily the 6 million who perished, but you know, it's a powerful thing to share a story with another person.
I think it's exactly that. I think one of the most important things that both of us probably share is the urge to tell. It's the urge to tell. That's my fight, my individual, right, and small fight against Holocaust deniers out there. And I will keep telling this story. I guess
Good,
until,
good.
and yes,
Yes.
absolutely. It's the least that I can do. It's the least that I owe for my grandparents, and to my grandparents from both sides. They're not here to tell it. I'm the vehicle. I'm their voice.
Yes, you said that earlier, and I couldn't agree more. And it took me way too long to understand the power of my voice in this particular story. But it's never too late to share your story. And Limor, I really can't thank you enough for sharing yours with me tonight.
Thank you so much, Alan. And by the way, one can have a voice, but without a platform, it can be useless. So thank you for inviting me here today, because I truly appreciate it. It really is. It's meaningful, and we obviously need to connect a little bit more, because there are too many similarities, and we have
100%.
this
Now
shared bond. We have this shared bond.
we do. And now that things are opening in New York, let's meet soon in New York City. I would love it.
I will take that invite.
Good. You have a great night, and thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. Good night, Alan.
Good night. Thank you so much to Limor Vink for sharing her story with us tonight. Please remember this: he who saves a life saves the world. As I leave you tonight, remember we all have choices to make in life. Speak up, do the hard thing, and let's make sure we stop hate in all its forms. I truly believe conversations like this can change the world around us. Until our next conversation, have a good night.